Hello everybody, this is Jan Rutherford and this is George Callahan, and we're going to talk a little bit about leadership. And for those of you that don't know, George Callahan served in the Army from 1940 to 1970 and served in World War II in Korea and Viet Nam. So hopefully we'll be able to get some insight about leadership from George. And George, one of the questions I had was, what was the earliest adversity you faced in your life? The hardest thing, the first obstacle that you ever had to overcome?
The first obstacle I had to overcome. Getting used to being in the service.
So, just being in the military.
Right.
Getting.
That was the beginning, because I'd never been in the military, and that, of course, that was a brand new experience.
Right, but that was 1940.
That was 1940.
And things were different then. That was even before the war or any of that.
Oh yes, I was in the Army before the war, when it was very competitive to get in the service. You just couldn't walk in and say, I want to be in the service, because it was so competitive and the depression was going on.
Right.
So they was very selective who they would let join up. And I had one tooth that needed a filling, and they said, you go home and get that taken care of, and you can come back and we'll enlist you. But until that's taken care of, you can't join up.
Right.
Of course, I wanted to join the Signal Corps, which I did.
Yeah.
And the Signal Corps and the Ordnance and the Finance were three outfits that required at least a high school education. If you didn't graduate from high school, you couldn't join the Signal Corps, Ordnance, or the Finance Corps.
Right.
You could go join different units, but you couldn't join the Signal Corps.
Yeah. And how old were you in 1940?
18.
18? And do you remember how tall you were and how much you weighed?
5'7", and 100 and... I just got in by the medium height and the medium weight, maybe 115.
115. And nobody knew that at that point that the war was coming, or you did know?
Oh, no. Nobody knew at that time, but we held a big maneuver upstate New York on the Canadian border. And that's where President Roosevelt came to review us. And we were training with the idea, I believe, to go to World War II.
Mm-hmm.
We had trucks with stovepipes on them that said cannons. We didn't have the supplies to go to war.
Right.
We still had World War I equipment, going to go fight World War II.
Right, and you said before that the Navy had all the money.
The Navy was what they call the first line of defense, and all the funds went to the Navy, and what was left over went to the other military units, the Army and the Marines.
Yeah.
And that's like I was mentioning. After we got through on the firing range, we had to go down range and pick out the lead out of the hills so it could be recycled.
Yeah. And do you remember when you were 18, what appealed to you about the Army, why you wanted to join versus...
I always wanted to join the Army. I used to listen to the radio, and they had stories about the military, about the Army especially. And I says, when I graduate from high school, I'm going to go join the Army.
Right.
Dad, was Uncle Frank in the military before you?
Oh no, I was in the service ahead of my brother. Frank went in during World War II.
Oh.
Yeah.
But
and George, what was the best advice you ever received on leadership?
when I joined the Army, I had to see my family doctor to make sure I was in good shape, which I was.
Yeah.
And he said, when you join the service, no matter how hard things might be, always say yes sir or no sir.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things that carried me through all my years in the service, is respect to your officers. And
Right.
when they told you to do something, it was yes sir.
Yeah.
He says, if you don't do that, you're in the wrong place.
and when you met a lot of different leaders, who inspired you the most of all the leaders that you worked with?
Oh, I'll have to think a minute for that because I had numerous people. That was my...
Yeah. Because you were, and again, you were enlisted. You were one of the youngest master sergeants.
That's right. I was enlisted. As promotions were opening, I was always given the opportunity to be promoted into the next grade. I never missed a grade. I was from private to master sergeant and warrant officer 1 to warrant officer 4.
And you, as a master sergeant, you were a master sergeant when you were 20, how old?
23.
23 years old, which was the highest enlisted rank.
That was the highest enlisted rank you could be.
Yeah. And so, and then you went through special forces when you were 40 years old?
40 years old.
Which is unbelievable. And that's when you went through jump school. So you met leaders in World War II, you met leaders in Korea, in Viet Nam, and then in special forces.
That's
There's
right.
really 4 parts of
There
your...
were so many fine leaders that it'd be hard to single out one against the other. Just be
Yeah.
very difficult to single one leader out against
Yeah.
the other leader.
And I mean, do you think the leaders that influenced you the most were leaders that you worked with and that you knew, or the leaders that were famous during their time, like MacArthur and Patton and Eisenhower?
More the ones that I knew that I worked with every day.
Yeah.
The other, Eisenhower and Patton and etc. were somebody we read about, but the ones that I knew were ones that you actually work with and showed you examples of how to be better, how
Yeah.
to be leaders.
So a lot of the way people led back then was by example. You
By
know.
example,
Yeah.
not so much about what you read about people, it's about the people that you work with on a daily basis.
Right.
Your leaders.
Right. And so, and do you think that was more in that time, in that era, that people led by example than they do now?
I think so. Yeah, that was the method in those days, by example.
Yeah. And from your own leadership experience, you know, as a leader, because you led as an enlisted man and then as a warrant officer, what leadership experience taught you the most?
What leadership taught me the most.
Yeah, which experience as a leader really taught you? Maybe it was something that was difficult, or where it was hard to get the men to do something.
Show your men that you could do what you expected them to do.
Mm-hmm.
Don't issue orders that you couldn't do yourself.
Yeah. And you saw lots of different circumstances where people reacted differently. I mean, whether it was in combat or in,
Oh, yes.
but I mean, you know, how did you get people to do things when they were really stressed out, and when you were in a crisis mode, when the outcome was not certain, that it was very unpredictable what might happen?
Show leadership and show that you're willing to go forward before you ask them to go forward.
Right. Literally lead from the front. Lead from the front.
Lead from the front. That's correct, Jim.
Yep. And you're going to be at my son's graduation in May
Looking
to see him,
forward to it.
to see Kevin graduate from West Point. So if you were going to be the guest speaker at West Point graduation, what would you say to the cadets? I mean, what advice would you give them about leadership and, you know, in a career, you know, that they're going to be in the military 20, 30 years?
Don't expect your men to do things that you wouldn't do yourself. Be able to show them that you can lead, and then expect them to follow you.
Yeah. And how do you think the leadership will be different for, you know, Kevin's class than it was, you know, for 2012 to 2042? How do you think that will be different than it was 1940 to 1970?
Well, they have more technologies than we had. We had basic technologies. We were the Model T, and now they're the super type. We had older type weapons from World War I. They've got almost unlimited funds up to a point where they get the best equipment, and we were still using the old equipment.
Yeah.
And by leading the men forward, as you say, leading from the front, will show your men that you can do about anything.
Yeah. And do you remember the advice you gave me back in 1979?
Yes, I certainly do.
Yeah.
Work with everybody. Don't be afraid to get down and work with anybody. But when you separate your friends, pick your friends